a religious caller who wants to talk about the cultural acceptance of bad things like founding fathers of the United States owning slaves. And I don't know where the religious element is, but my interest is piqued.
Well, this is Connor.
Oh.
So.
Okay. Let's go. Let's talk to Connor. Connor in Texas. You're live with Eric and V.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Doing well. So what about the founding fathers?
Well, so first off, I want to say that it's not really a religious thing. It's a type of argument, and that was the example I was going to use to start off with that I wanted to hear y'all's thoughts on.
Okay.
So y'all know that whenever this comes up, people will, so with the example was the founding fathers, like there are people who will use it, who will say they use the example as a pseudo defense that, we look at it now as a bad thing, but then they'll use this defense like at the time, whether or not they did or did not see it as a bad thing, and it was acceptable at the time. And the question is, how do you respond when someone brings that up, or what is just y'all's thoughts on when someone brings that up?
Sure.
That it was acceptable at the time, even though it's not now.
Yeah, the context that this usually gets brought up in is one, like let's go with slavery, right? If we were to say, hey, is the Christian God pro-slavery? Because there are definite like rules in the Old Testament about how to treat and own your slaves. And the response is, oh, well, it was, it was acceptable at the time. But if you believe in a God that is unchanging, that has perfect morals, that have always been perfect, then what was acceptable at the time doesn't matter. So if we were talking about, anyone else, then yeah, contextualizing things helps us understand them better. But if you're talking about a perfect God, there's a problem there. And that's usually
I wasn't trying to bring religion into this.
Oh no, it's just that's usually the context I find this discussion happening in is people saying, oh well, I can justify, you're talking to counter apologists. Of course, that's where we go with it is
yeah, because the thing is, this is more like people who are I guess they put on their patriot blinders when stuff like this comes up, and this is the kind of stuff they go to.
Yeah. The way I think about it, or the first thing that I say is, I'm pretty sure the people who were being enslaved thought it was a bad thing. Like when you talk about, well, like that's the problem with the question ultimately is when you talk about, well, did they know that it was bad? And like, was it known societally that this was wrong? There is always another side to that equation, which is, yes, it was known that it was wrong because it was actively harming people. And it's telling that you equate society and what society thinks to the enslavers as opposed to the enslaved. So in my experience, we need to shift the conversation into, all right, why were we listening to the people who were saying it was okay versus the people who obviously knew that it wasn't?
Right.
That's
yeah. Do you have a different take on it?
Nope.
Well,
it was just something I thought about. I was curious, like, how could someone possibly see it that way? I mean, I try to understand why someone would try and make that argument, but it's always just like, I just can't wrap my mind around trying to say that myself.
I mean, putting on my religious hat, when I was a believer, I was told, well, it stood the test of time. If something is transcendently, reliable as a source for knowledge and ethics and yada yada yada, then it should be it should have stood the test of time. It wasn't until much later that I realized that an appeal to the age of a thing is just a fallacy. But for a lot of people who
it's basically someone saying tradition for tradition's sake.
And now I have the song.
Is that what you're saying?
No.
Am I going nuts?
What?
Isn't the entirety of our ongoing conversation about progressive revelation and the fact that you think that there are traditional things that are required to be upheld? Like, I'm sorry, I'm just very confused that you don't understand that argument.
If you want me to clear that up, it's that we should not accept something just because it has always been around.
Okay.
If that's where you want to go with this.
Well, not necessarily. Like, I will accept that. That is your take on it. What I'm curious about is, why is progressive revelation different than saying, well, they didn't know better at the time, even though it was still bad at the time?
Wait, hold on a second. I'm sorry, I'm trying to make connections here, but my brain's just not there.
I'm happy to rephrase. Our conversations have talked about the dispensation of knowledge of morality over time, correct? We've talked about how people get progressive revelation according to the Baha'i faith, right?
Yeah, we use progressive as in like continuation.
Okay, but there was like a before time and then an after time when something was considered moral versus not moral, right?
Okay, I think that sounds about right.
Okay, so I'm just confused because that's where I thought you were, but now you're saying you don't understand why someone would make the argument that owning slaves was okay at one point because it was considered culturally acceptable? Like, doesn't that sound like the same thing?
So
that's what
my original question was about, like, when someone is in defense of the founding fathers and how they own slaves, that's what they would bring up.
I've seen it brought up that way. But I am curious how you don't view that as a problem with what you believe. Or do you? Are you calling to say that you've found a problem with the Baha'i faith and are kind of wanting to share that?
Oh no, this was its complete own thing, completely separate.
Well, it definitely sounds like you have two thoughts that can't live together at the same time in your mind. That's cognitive dissonance. How do you resolve that?
Could you clarify what you mean? Like what you're thinking right now?
Sure. Actually, I think V will probably be more concise.
I mean, I'll try. So I've got two different subjects, right? You called in before.
No, I understand cognitive dissonance.
No, right. I'm going into these topics specifically. In the past, You've called in about revelation, morality, how things are continual and people are, revealed the next level of moral evolution or whatever. I don't know if that's the exact terminology, but there is an understanding there that at one point, people who you consider to be good were doing not good things because they didn't know better. Whereas on this call, you're saying you don't understand why people would think that the founding fathers were good while they were owning slaves because they didn't know better, right? That is the dissonance right there, because you can't say you don't understand one and also hold the same view elsewhere.
I'm trying to think of what in our previous calls, like how it. So
really,
I'll probably just try to clarify with that we're taught not to accept something just because it has always been around. For us, it's the tradition for tradition's sake should not be the reason why we do something or follow something. That's the way. And that we should investigate everything on an individual basis to check it for its own pros and cons.
As long as you don't change anything based on our past conversation. Our literal entire last call was about you saying it's okay to question as long as you don't change shit, because the universal house of justice has decided that certain things are important or should stick around, which to me...
They didn't decide it.
Okay.
I can't do this all over again.
Okay, yeah. So I you know where we're going to go with that. Connor.
Yeah.
Do you think your God has become a better or worse person, in quotes? Is more or less moral now than before?
What's the could you please specify the time, like how far back in time you're discussing? I just want to make sure I understand you properly.
Sure. Slaves.
You're going back to slavery in the Old Testament?
Sure. Or we could go back to, I don't know, when women had even less rights. Like, has your God changed their mind about any of those things?
I'm trying to figure out how to summarize this. What is essentially a long conversation.
Usually when somebody gives that answer, it's because they're having to do a really, really large set of flexing
mental gymnastics.
Yes, thank you.
Well,
that usually happens when you need a lot of mental gymnastics. The long story. Usually,
I'm not trying to do mental gymnastics. It's just that there are different components that work together on this, and I'm not trying to get out of this. It's just I don't want to take up too much of your time as well. But I'm also not like the best communicator, as y'all are aware of.
You seem fine.
And
heck, you're getting to words faster than I am, so you're doing fine.
All right, let's try and restart on your ends.
Actually, let's
say it again. Your thought.
Sure. Has your God become more or less moral over time?
So, from the understanding that we have in the faith, is that God itself has remained the same.
Okay.
But what the teachings are brought, whatever they are at the time that they are sent, typically start at one level.
Okay, so
to do some work to build up
right,
to
right.
improve society.
So
and then it's slow improvement with each message sent.
Right. So if I wanted to be a really good neighbor, but I'm going to start off by throwing motor oil on their front lawn, you got to recognize that I'm actually not a bad person, and I wouldn't actually do that. That doesn't make any sense. That makes absolutely zero sense.
Well, I mean, the first star would probably stop throwing the motor oil on the lawn.
Well, I'm talking about
it's a first step. It's kind of like a
hold on a second. Hold on.
Period of time.
I think we're not at the same level here. I'm talking about the God, not the God's commandments at this point, right? If I am a really great person, but what I'm telling you to do is fucking awful, then I don't know how you get off saying that I'm a really great person. It just doesn't work that way.
That brings up another nuance. That brings up a whole nother conversation on whether or not every single thing is it sounds like you're trying to dismiss it with broad strokes. I'm not trying to dismiss it. I'm trying to. It's difficult to try and be nuanced and direct at the same time.
I don't think it's nuance. I think it's gymnastics.
I'm sure there's nuance there, but I think that we've had this conversation so many times, and I'm honestly just kind of confused about why you can explain that and then say, but I don't understand why people culturally accept things that are bad. Right? You understand that is the same line of reasoning.
I see why you say that, and it was something I thought of, like, this might come up this way, but I didn't really have time to think over it.
Well, you led with it.
Well, now that we've brought it up and you're thinking over it, what are your thoughts there? Is that cognitive dissonance for you? Can you understand why people would make that argument?
No, I can understand why you'd make the argument. It's just
it's not convincing.
I'm trying to think. No, I'm trying to think on the spot of like how to go into this.
We should have like a little timer that comes up on the screen.
Yeah,
like, click, click.
So the thing is I really want to give Connor the chance to respond, but I know that thinking about it is important. But that I don't know. Maybe we should pick this back up.
Here's the thing. If you do not understand why people make excuses for people that they, idolize for being good people in a bad system, then by definition, you cannot understand the crux of your own religious morality. If you can understand your own religious morality as you have explained it to us, then you can understand that argument. And what's more, you should be convinced by it.
Yeah.
So you're in a little bit of a pickle here. And I understand you need to take some time to think it over. Please do. Please call back and we'll talk about this exact crux where you're not convinced of a thing that convinces you.
Okay.
Cool.
All right. Take care, Connor.
Thanks.
I got a little confused there.
I mean, same, but probably for different reasons. Like, I personally, like, that would be like saying, a core fundamental piece of my understanding of the world is that the sky is blue, right? I'm going back to the color of the sky.
Sure.
Throw back to last week. And then you call in again after having an entire argument about how you believe the sky is blue to say, there are these weird people who make the argument that the sky is blue, and I just don't get it. And so either there is a core piece that I am missing that has not been communicated about why these people's claims that the sky is blue is ridiculous and laughable, but yours is okay. Or you have to reconcile with the fact that by your own definition, you should agree with these people who are making some pretty awful claims.
The thing for me on that is I do remember being faced with problems in my faith and ignoring them and hearing why they were wrong and just making myself not really just quashing those thoughts. And then every time they came up, it needed to be addressed over and over again. I think that was actually one of the reasons why shows like this was important for my process, because I needed to keep hearing it over and over again. I needed to keep challenging those ideas until it finally sunk in that there's something that needs to be explored there.
And while I am happy to talk to repeat theist callers even about the same thing over and over again, the really cool thing about this format is that you can go back and watch your own conversations over again before you call back, so that even if you've repressed the fact that it was uncomfortable to talk about, you have an understanding that you called in and we had a 45-minute conversation about this exact topic 2 weeks ago.
True enough. Okay. Well,